Welcome back to our continuing studies on the Gospel of Matthew. And this and the next two readings following this, I'm going to use some translations that come from historical Bibles in English language, which are historically important that we do not, as a rule, use in the modern era. They have since been eclipsed and passed on. The nature of their translation, their use of language. In terms of what we could say is the foundational Bible to all of our modern Bibles is Tyndale's translation of 1525. The King James Version, which comes out in the 17th century, is very much indebted to the Tyndale translation. So this reading in Matthew is chapter 21 and verses 12 and 13, reading from Tyndale's translation of the Gospel of Matthew in 1525. And Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all them that bought and sold in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves, and said to them, it is written, mine house will be called the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. The 21st century commercialization of the Christian faith can take some pointers on the marketing of the faith by the people who ran the Jewish temple in the first century. Let us begin with this first major point. We need to ask what was done in the temple was well-intentioned or not. If you answer no, then you cannot appreciate how radical the act that Jesus did. You see, what Jesus did was not the removal of a few nefarious types who were making a few shekels off some gullible pilgrims. Yes, there was probably some abuse in the system. That's not to be discounted. The problem, though, was not the corruption, but the turning of the faith experience into a business. So what are we saying? Understand that what was going on here was well-intentioned of good purposes. And that sense, what Jesus was disrupting was something that was useful and valuable for the work of the temple. To aid in understanding this passage, we need to understand what the word temple means. Now, obviously, in modern English usage, we use the word temple and have an understanding, but we live in a day and age where the idea of a temple is largely not practiced. I mean, unless you are familiar with Mormonism or come out of that background, you don't use the word temple. In Mormon theology, a temple is a key part of their rites, R-I-T-E-S. So, for example, if you want to get married in a traditional Mormon marriage ceremony, you have to go through the temple. If you want to be baptized, you go through the temple. It's a part of their, well, we could call non-Christian vision of their faith system. Now, if you go back to the original Greek, there are two words for temple. The first word is naos, and we can spell that in English as N-A-O-S. This word means the building which was the temple. In the New International Version, in verse 12, we have the phrase temple area. Now, this is not a literal translation. This is one of the things that translators have to do. You have to make value judgments and kind of do things in a way to try and get things to such that people can understand them. Now, in the original, the translation I used, Tyndale, he uses the word temple, but the NIV uses the word or phrase temple area. And the reason for that is for purposes of clarity, because what the NIV is doing is reflecting an underlying Greek word. The word area is not used in the original Greek. In the Greek text, you have the other word for temple used, which is hieros. Now, hieros can be spelled in English H-I-E-R-O-S. So we have these two words for temple, but they do not mean the same thing. What the NIV did is give the meaning of the original Greek word in English. And we can understand it this way. If we take the word naos, and today think of a church, the church, the place that we gather to worship on Sunday, where we have our social events, where we have our prayer meetings, maybe where we have our youth group. That building is the church proper. So naos. Hieros, in that sense, would be the piece of land which the church sits on. So when we think of the hieros, we would think in modern terms, the church building, the parking lot, the tool shed, and all the property that the church includes. So when Jesus entered into the temple, as Tyndale says, which is true but not clear English, Jesus was entering into the temple complex. The merchandising of the temple was not done in the temple proper, not in the naos, but in the hieros. The temple area or complex had a series of areas which, as you move through them, became more restrictive as to who could go in. You had an outer court of Gentiles, then of women, so in other words, the area which only Jews could be in, then of Jewish males, then of the priests, and in the temple was the Holy of Holies, which a priest entered once a year. The business stalls were in the court of the Gentiles. It was, in that sense, a symbol of indifference of many Jews to the non-Jews when it came to the faith. In other words, it became a very graphic symbol of the fact that the Jews had no real desire as a whole to reach out to the non-Jewish people and bring them into the faith system. The quotation Jesus used is taken from Isaiah chapter 56, which is a prophetic announcement that the faith is for all people. The temple was to be a house of prayer for all the nations. This is hard to do if you have created a shopping mall in the court of the Gentiles. Jesus, in cleansing the temple, was proclaiming that the coming of the kingdom of God was for all the nations. This is the primary concern of Jesus, but not the only. The financial offerings for the temple that had to be paid by Tyranian shekels. So one of the things what we're saying is when you look at what was going on in the court of the Gentiles, there was a certain amount of legitimacy for it from the religious leader's perspective. The only way you could pay the offering was through the Tyranian shekel. That means you had to have currency exchange because people came from all over the Roman Empire. Now remember, the Roman Empire did not have a universal monetary system, so it varied from place to place to place. And needless to say, if you are having currency exchanges, well, people can make money off of it. And then you had the fact that if you came from great distance, you wouldn't be bringing an animal from home to make a sacrifice, so you needed to purchase that. And needless to say, if they were buying and selling animals, they could control which animals were acceptable and not acceptable, and again, make some money. Now, the point we're saying here is understand that there was a certain amount of legitimacy to the practice, but it was also very exploitative. And the whole of the system was open to abuse, very much so. And Jesus was concerned on the one hand about the abuses of the system, and on the other hand, the symbolism of the system, which was pushing the Gentiles out of the picture. Jesus came and partook in an action which, in light of the prophets, we could call a prophetic action, which is that the temple was to be the house of prayer for all the nations.